It would, of course, take something extremely exceptional to match Glenrowan and Powers Lookout and Alpine National Park, and frankly, I am not sure that many other countries could have provided it. But Hal assured me that he had one last special something for us to see, something that existed nowhere else in the world but in one small corner of Victoria. Beyond that, he would not be drawn. The next day, to add to the savor of pleasure deferred, we went to a sleepy, old-fashioned coastal resort called Lake's Entrance, where we stopped for the night and had a nice seafood supper and a shuffle around, and the day after set off for our mystery attraction en route to Melbourne. For quite a spell we drove through flat, sunny, uneventful farming country, and I sat in the back in a state of tranquil mindlessness when abruptly Alan steered the car off the highway beside a large sign I couldn't see well enough to read and parked in a large and mostly empty parking lot. I unfolded myself from the back seat and stepped blinking from the car. Beside us was a long, tubular building, rather like a very large cloche, but made of concrete and painted white. I looked questioningly at Hal. "The giant worm," he announced. I stared at him in wonder and admiration. Not as in the famous giant worms of southwest Gippsland? The same. You familiar with them then? I gave the hollow laugh that such a question deserved. I had been reading about these behemoths of the underworld for months, albeit mostly in footnotes and other passing references. I had never expected to find a shrine to them. Even in the land of extraordinary creatures, the giant worms of Gippsland are exceptional. Called Megascolidus australis, they are world's largest earthworms, growing up to 12 feet in length and more than 6 inches in diameter. So substantial are they that you can actually hear them moving through the earth with a gargling sound like bad plumbing. What it is about this one small corner of Victoria that led to the evolution of extremely outsized worms is a question that science has yet to answer. But then it must be said, very few of the world's best minds are drawn to the questions of earthworm physiology and distribution. However, Hal promised such knowledge as the world holds was contained within the tubular structure before us. We procured 3 tickets and stepped eagerly into the display area. On the wall facing us, as we entered, was a blown-up photograph taken early in the 20th century showing 4 ridiculously pleased-looking men holding a droopy 12-footer, little thicker than a normal earthworm but clearly ambitious in the length department. This I studied with great interest until Carmel drew my attention to a display of living giant worms. There were in a large glass panel, half an inch thick and filled with earth, rather like a very large ant farm, which hung on the wall. According to a label, the The case contained a pair of giant worms. In a couple of spots where the earth had come away from the glass, we could see a millimeter or two of living giant worm, but as they weren't moving or doing anything. Megascolides is extremely devoted to rest, it seems. The experience was, I confess, a trifle anticlimactic. I had rather hoped there would be a petting corner or perhaps a tamer with a whip and a chair getting them to go through hoops. Alan and I tried to enliven the worm by tapping lightly on the glass, but it declined to respond. Beside the panel were two long glass tubes filled with formaldehyde and containing a pair of preserved giant worms, each of normal earthworm circumference, but about 4 or 5 feet long. Not exactly titans, but long enough to impress. Worms don't preserve terribly well, and the formaldehyde had horrible little bits of worm skin floating in it, as if somebody had been shaking the tubes, or more probably, as Alan and I conclusively established, by tapping on them. It was hard to look at them without growing a little queasy. In the next room was a short film that told all that was known about the giant earthworm, which is to say, almost nothing. They are reclusive, delicate, not terribly numerous, and deeply uncooperative creatures, and that's not easy to study, even assuming you had a mind to. As you may recall from childhood experiments, earthworms really don't wish to come out of their holes, and if you pull, they tend to snap. Well, imagine trying to tug a 12-foot-long worm out of its burrow. Nearly impossible. The one thing the Giant Worm Museum establishes beyond question is that you can only get so much mileage out of giant worms. Recognizing this, the proprietors had provided many other displays. Next door were some glass cases containing live snakes, including the famous and fearsome taipan, Australia's deadliest snake. Alan and I conducted some further glass tapping experiments, then retreated 4 yards together in a platonic embrace when the taipan snarled at us, or possibly just yawned, opening its jaws wide enough to swallow a human head, or so it seemed. Deciding that henceforth we would keep our hands in our pockets, we followed Camille outdoors, where there was a compound containing yet more animals. Kangaroos and emus, a forlorn-looking dingo, some caged cockatoos, half a dozen curled and dozing wombats, and a couple of koalas also dozing. It was a very hot, still afternoon and evidently siesta time, so the enclosures had an air of profound inertness. Even the cockatoos slept, but I strolled among them with fascination, delighted to see so much native exotica brought together in one place. I peered with particular interest at the wombats, a quite thick, short-legged and rather inactive quadruped, with great appearance of stumpy strength, as the first Englishman to see one, recorded in 1788 in words that could not be bettered. The same man was a little less reliable with the kangaroos, which he described as a small bird of beautiful plumage. Alan and Carmel looked on with the tolerant amusement with which an American might view a display of raccoons and chipmunks, for most of these were animals that they saw regularly in their natural state. But to me, every one was a novelty, even the dingo, which is, after all, just a dog. I made 2 complete circuits of the menagerie. Then, with a look of satisfaction, I gave a nod and we set off once again for Melbourne. We went out to dinner at a Vietnamese restaurant in the inner Melbourne suburb of Richmond, on a street lined seemingly for miles with exotic restaurants. And Alan made the point, with which I could not argue, that Melbourne is an infinitely better city than Sydney for dining out. In the course of conversation, Alan asked if I was going to the Great Barrier Reef, a place for which he had a special fondness. I said I wasn't on this trip, but I was when I came back in a few weeks. Just be careful they don't leave you out there. He gave a thin smile. What do you mean? There was a story here recently. One of the dive companies left an American couple out on the reef. Left them? I said, puzzled but intrigued. Hal nodded and speared at some pasta. Yeah, it miscounted somehow and went back to port 2 passengers short. Bit of a pizza for the people left behind, wouldn't you say? I mean, 1 minute you're swimming around looking at coral and fish, having the time of your life, and then you surface and discover that the boat has gone and you're all alone in a very large and empty ocean. They couldn't swim to shore? He smiled tolerantly at my ignorance. Barrier Reef's a long way out, Bryson, something over 30 miles where they were. Long way to swim. And there were no islands or anything? Not where they were. They were effectively out to sea. Apparently, there were a couple of things they could swim to. A big moored pontoon that the dive company used, and some kind of a coral atoll, both a couple of miles away. So presumably muttering oaths and understandably feeling a little hard done by, they started swimming towards those. What they couldn't know, was that they were swimming across a deep water channel. And guess what lurks in deep water channels? Sharks, I said. He nodded at my perspicacity. So imagine it, you're miles out to sea, stranded because the company you've entrusted your life to has forgotten you. You're tired. You're swimming towards a coral outcrop, and it's hard going because the tide is coming in. The light is fading, and you look around and see fins circling you, maybe half a dozen of them. He gave me a moment to form a picture in my mind, then fixed me with a deadpan expression. I don't know about you, but I think I'd ask for my money back, he laughed. So nobody came back to rescue them? It was 2 days before anyone noticed they were missing, said Carmel. I turned to her in wonder. 2 days? by which time, of course, they were long gone. Eaten by sharks? She shrugged. No way of knowing, but presumably. Anyway, they were never seen again. Wow. We ate in thoughtful silence for a minute. Then I mentioned that every time there was an odd story in Australia, it seems to come out of Queensland. My favorite of the moment concerned a German man recently detained outside Cairns who had arrived on a tourist visa in 1982 and spent the past 17 years wandering on foot through the northern deserts, living primarily off roadkill. I was also extremely partial to the story of a group of illegal immigrants who were brought from China on an old fishing boat which dropped them in shallow water 100 yards off a beach near Cairns. They were caught when one of their members, carrying a suitcase dripping water conspicuously from sodden trousers and squelching with every step, presented himself at the news wagon's shop and politely asked the proprietor if he would order a fleet of taxis to take him and some associates to the railroad station at Cairns. Nearly every day, it seemed, the papers had a story of arresting improbability under a Queensland dateline. Alan nodded in accord. There's a reason for that, of course. What's that? They're crazy in Queensland. Madder than cut snakes. You'll like it up there. In the morning, Alan ran me to the airport by way of his office. While we went off to hold the front page or do whatever editors do, he left me to sit at his big desk and play in his swivel chair. When he returned, he was carrying a folder which he passed to me. I dug out some stuff on that American couple that disappeared. I thought it might be of use to you. Thank you, I said, quite touched. It should give you some tips on how not to get left on the reef. I know what a dozy bugger you are, Bryson. At the airport, he jumped out of the car and helped me haul my bag out of the trunk and said his farewells. He shook my hand. And remember what I said about watching yourself up north, he said. Madder than cut snakes, I repeated, to show that I had been listening. Madder than a sack of them. He smiled, then jumped back in the car, waved, and was gone.